Welcome, I'm Glenn Davison, and I'd like to talk about kites that don't fly well. They turn left to right, they spin, they don't rise, they flutter in flight, they dive, and they crash. I'll start simply with a bunch of information that's sort of basic, and then I'll go into more detail because there's many kinds of kites, and the way to achieve successful flight can be complicated. So Hank said, my swallow kite irritates me because I've never been able to get it to fly well. And what I responded with was, so what you're telling me is that you can't stomach your swallow. So here's the topics that I'll cover. I'll talk about the kite as being part of a system that has many parts and how you can get to create a kite repair table at a festival to help others with assembly and repair. I'll also talk about correcting 6 different flight issues, each of which has multiple solutions. I'll talk about 8 tactics for repairs and describe the specifics about how to do those repairs. Then the case studies that I give you include 11 reasons why kites fail. There's actions that are taken in the field, and those might be different from the actions that you take or you would take to repair a kite at home. A kite repair checklist is included to cover all bases, and after the repair, what to do then. So it's not just a kite. A teacher asks a class to name something that's completely useless when flying a kite. And a troublemaking student raises their hand and the teacher says, yes, thank you. Can you name something else? So again, it's not just a kite, it's a system that includes many parts. Just the way that a car has an engine, wheels, brakes, a body, and a driver, it's not just a transmission going down the road, it's the same thing for a kite. A kite is part of a system that includes wind speed, wind direction, location that you're flying the kite, the altitude that you're flying the kite, the flying line, the bridle, and the person controlling the kite. Some people will say that it's the wind, and there's a wind range for flight for each kite, and depending on the kite that you're trying to fly, there might be too much or too little wind. What I prefer, and what most kite flyers prefer, is steady wind, and they prefer that over a certain wind speed because steady wind allows you to select a kite that flies in that wind speed and have it fly. It also allows you to tune a kite to that current wind speed and have it fly rather than the wind speed changing and the kite dropping to the ground. You have to relaunch it. So one way to accomplish steady wind is to wait for the wind. And what I say is, if there's no wind, go have lunch. Another thing is that it's the flying location. So don't fly kites behind a building. Don't fly kites surrounded by trees. Don't fly kites behind a hill. And what I'm saying in general is that you need clear access to the wind in order to get the kite to fly well. So sometimes it's not the kite, it's the flying location. But it can be the kite. You can go ahead and blame the kite. Sometimes it is the kite's fault. Many kites that you see in stores are made to sell. They're not necessarily made to fly well. And the ship kite that you see on the right-hand side, I think, is the perfect example of that. My wife said that she tried to assemble one of these ship kites, and it took her a long time. And after, it's at least a half an hour assembly. It was probably more. And after that, it still doesn't fly well. You need sort of a perfect wind for that kind of kite to fly well. Now, you could also say that the problem is the bridle. Now, bridles and tails, we're going to talk about those. Now, most of you guys know, beginners know that, or kind of would like to know this a little bit better. The lower the toe point is, the more stable it is. And that's good for light wind. So here, the top leg is longer with a lower toe point. That means I've slid this point down the line further, giving a longer top leg. And this is better for light wind because it tilts the kite back. See the angle here versus the angle there. In strong wind, a shorter top leg where the toe point is actually slid higher on the green bridle, giving a sort of a tilted angle to the kite. And when you change the angle of attack, you might need to add tails or some other form of drag like a drogue to the back of the kite to keep it flying in that stronger wind. Now, it could also be the tail is the problem. Now, the question is, why do kites have tails? So you know when they're happy. And tails can be functional, they can be decorative, or they can be both. So in one of my books, I have an illustration that I took which shows different types of tail, from banner tail to streamer tail to multiple tails to fuzzy tail to loop tail to a V tail to a tube tail. In general, tails should be lightweight and they should create drag. And many times you would add tails in strong wind and then remove them in light wind. I remember being on a field and somebody was having difficult trouble flying their kite, and it was because they had removed the tails, and the tails were necessary for that kite to fly. Now, I've heard different rules of thumb, but a general rule of thumb is that a tail should be about 7 to 10 times the height of the kite, and a better relationship would be that the tail might be equal in area to the kite itself. Some people, will change those numbers based on their experience. Now, I'd like to talk, before we go into more detail, because I have quite a bit more, about a kite repair table. And this is something that I like to do at festivals. You set up a repair table at a festival and a small sign, and you'll have a line of people, especially if the wind is strong. And all you need to bring is tape and tails. That's it, because for the most part, you'll be adjusting the bridle, you'll be putting on some tails, and you'll be taping things back together again. So I really do recommend that, because it's worthwhile for the people that are there, and really it's fun for you to help them. And my line at the bottom says, it's not all about the kites. There's a guy named Patch Adams who is a doctor, and he said, you treat the disease, you win or you lose. You treat a person, and I guarantee you'll win no matter what the outcome. So if you're helping people with their kites, be focused on the person and not necessarily the kite. I made a lot of friends helping people fix their kites. So now let's talk about the process of correcting flight problems, because I'd like to go beyond what you would do with bridles and tails and go into a little bit more depth. So here's my outline of issues. The kite spins and dives, the kite leans to one side, the kite's unstable in strong wind, the kite flies low on the horizon, or the kite flies directly overhead, or the kite immediately crashes when I try to launch it. And then after these sort of issue topics, then I'm going to go into some case studies. So kite spins and dives or turns. That could be the spars. So make sure that all the spars are in their correct positions. Don't fly a kite if the spars are missing or broken. I've seen people who just won't give up even though they have spars missing. If the kite's too flat, allow the kite to flex by using a thinner spreader or add a dihedral to the kite. Not necessarily on the field, but that could help fix the problem. If your kite has a tension line, then you can add tension on the field. That's easy. And some kites don't require tails, but if your kite is swaying left and right, that's called yaw, or if it spins and dives, adding more tails might be a solution, even if it has a tail already. So now the next correction would be if the kite leans to one side. That might mean a couple of things. One is one of your spars might be cracked, so you might not even know that it's cracked. And if you repair or replace the spars, and I recommend replacing them, replace them in pairs so that the left and right are equal. Check the bridles to make sure that the left and right bridles are exactly equal. You could pull the bridle straight up. You could pull the bridle straight down. Those are common things that kite flyers do to check to see that they're off center, and then adjust it so that they're back to center. And check the spreaders to make sure that they bow evenly. And if they don't bow correctly, replace them or change them. If a spreader has a ferrule off center, that means that instead of having the ferrule directly in the center where my thumbs are, the ferrule is off to one side, then it acts like one spar is longer, and the shorter spar will cause it to turn and dive. Now the spine itself should be straight, and the spine should be located in the middle of the kite. I've seen kites under tension where the spine actually bows, making this side of the kite larger, this side of the kite smaller, and that turns the kite and causes it to crash. Balance the weight of the kite by hanging the kite from the bridle, and the kite should hang flat. If it doesn't hang flat, you might add tape to the higher side to just add a little bit of weight to bring it back to normal. Now, the kite is unstable in strong wind. That could be because there's a problem with the spars, and the tail, the spars are no longer bowing properly in the strong wind. The strong wind can show you a problem that didn't exist in lighter wind because they might not be symmetrical. So replace the spreaders. In strong wind, you might double or triple the number of tails. I had a kite repair that I did, which was just adding tails, in which I ended up adding 8 tails in order to get the kite to fly in a stable way. But after adding that many tails, it flew better. Sometimes longer tails are better than shorter ones. Can I have somebody unmute and tell me that they can still hear me?
Yep, still can hear you.
Oh, good. Excellent.
Sounding good.
Excellent. So say that a kite flies low in the sky and has little lift. That could mean that the wind is too light. So one thing you could do would be to wait for better wind. Another thing would be to flatten the kite out a little bit. If you have the ability to reduce the bow, you could do that so the kite is flatter to the wind, generating more lift. The kite could be too heavy for the current wind. You might need to wait for stronger wind. If there's enough wind, the toe point could be too low. So by adjusting the toe point, raise it or lower it in small increments in order to get a better toe point. Now, one of the things that I've done very successfully is I've taken a kite and then I hold the bridle in my hand and I tilt my fingers up and down to see what that does to the flight of the kite, adjusting the bridle in my fingers until I get the kite to fly steadily. Then I use that as my new toe point. If the kite is flying low and has little lift, your spreaders might be too soft and they might be bending too much. So you could replace your spreaders to flatten the kite a little bit more. Or, like I said, you could reduce the tension to flatten the kite to the wind, giving it more lift. Now say that the kite flies almost directly overhead. A lot of novices assume that this is a great thing, but it could cause problems with the flight. In that case, the toe point is too high. Lower the toe point a little bit at a time until it flies better. And flying almost directly overhead could be caused by a thermal. So what I've done is I try to counteract the thermal with the kite directly overhead by walking away from the kite and giving the kite line so that it can eventually get back into steady flight. Another way would be to add more tails. Now the kite crashes when I try to launch. This is a common problem with kids and new kites. It could mean that there's not enough wind, so that they're trying to fly a kite when there isn't enough wind to fly it. One of my phrases is that you need 2 things. You need a kite and you need wind. The other problem might be throwing the kite. I've seen that many, many times. I'm sure you have as well, throwing a kite actually destabilizes it. The air around the kite is in turbulence, and what you want is the air to lift the kite. The wind lifts the kite, not throwing it. That doesn't help. Angling the kite properly toward the wind so that the bridles are in front of the kite and facing the wind are also important. And solution number 3, the wind might be obstructed. So what you want to do is find an open area where you have access to the wind. And I've seen this problem even in experienced flyers where they don't think about their spot. A lot of people want to just take 2 steps out of the building or 2 steps out of their car and fly the kite right there. And often that's not the best spot. You might need an opening between buildings in order to get the current wind. So if the kite crashes, check the wind direction, check the trees and flags, and the flyer, as I was talking to Ron before, should never run in circles. I often use a long launch or a long line launch, whichever you call it, to quickly pull the kite up into smooth wind. That might mean that between you and the kite, you need 100 feet, sometimes even more, because you want to go up above trees, buildings, berms, or boardwalks in order to get up into open and smooth wind. And also, if the kite crashes on launching, it might be the same things as when it leans or turns to one side, a broken spar, that kind of thing. So now that we've talked about all of those things, let's talk about some tactics for repairing the kites. So one thing to do is to use tape. And you didn't use your head to break the kite, but you can use your head to fix them. And using tape, I saw recently online, people talked about all the different kinds of tape that they prefer. One of my favorite sayings is that I can't find my invisible tape anywhere. But one thing that I do use in order to make repairs invisible is I try to use repair tape that matches the color of the kite or clear repair tape. I haven't tried all of these tapes myself. I have used strapping tape on kids' kites because the strapping tape is very inexpensive. It comes in big rolls and it has fibers inside that make it very strong. So for kids' kites, it's a good option. I have multicolored ripstop tape. So if one of my nylon kites has a tear in it, I use ripstop tape for repair. And I have recently tried Emma Kite sail repair tape. And if you can see me right now, this is an example of that repair tape. And I thought, you know, gee, it looks like it has fiberglass in it, so it looks very strong, but you'll notice that it's not completely clear. So, you know, maybe from if you put it on the back of the kite, you wouldn't notice the repair as much, especially if it's in the sky. But it also peels off, and I press it down to get the bubbles out. So I thought that was a fair solution. Maybe you have preferences for one of these other types of tapes. It would be a good thing to discuss in detail. Putting on tape, well, you definitely want to clean the area that you're going to repair. Lay the sail flat on the table, remove all the wrinkles so that the tear hopefully lines up, and then match the grid. So you make sure that it's sort of right in line. Round the corners of the tape before you apply it. Place the tape over the tear, and try to have the tape go beyond the tear by about ½ inch. And when you're putting down the tape, be sure that you don't stretch or pull the tape so that it wrinkles the kite again. Now, glue, I don't think glue is really good for a quick fix. On the field, I would not use glue. On the repair table, I don't use glue. If you have wood, like I have in this picture here, I recommend slicing the wood at an angle. That gives you a greater surface on which to bond the two back together again. Now, Some people like using super glue, but super glue is prone to shock. You can actually test that by using super glue on a ferrule and then dropping your kite on the spine so that the ferrule actually gets shocked and it'll release the bond. As an alternative to that, you might consider this rubberized super glue, which is BSI IC2000. I have a picture of that, Bob Smith Industries. I use that on caps and ferrules because it bonds and holds, and having a rubberized effect kind of keeps that hold in place. For quick repairs, I avoid glue. It's messy, it's slow to cure. I even avoid glue when I'm in workshops because it takes time, and people assume that if you apply more glue, you get a better bond. And that's not really almost ever true. What you do is you get a heavier bond that takes a lot longer to cure. So for spars, one thing to be aware of is that you can have uneven flex. So the right side on the red spar is much too straight and the left side is much too curved. What you want is good even flex for your spars and to match them. I'm showing it between two fingers, but you can still do that with your hands left and right to stress the spar. And say that you have a joint or even two joints. So you have a left spar, a right spar, a center spar with two ferrules in the middle. You might flex the whole thing to see whether it flexes evenly. That's a good way of finding problems with your spars. I've seen people that try to mend with tape. Sometimes what you have on hand is what you use. Again, replace broken spars. Spars that have been mended with tape really don't hold up well, they don't fly well, and can be just problematic in general. Beware of unequal diameter rods. I haven't really come across that problem, but it can be a problem. If you want to add strength, you could add a rod inside. You could thread wrap. There's other alternatives for adding strength, such as adding epoxy on the outside. And if you're using a bamboo for your spine and spreader, you can shave those to get even flex. One of the things that's interesting is if you're using a variety of materials, which I do, you can compare the weight of different replacements, and sometimes the weight of the one that you like better is going to be less. So you might be surprised which material works better. Now, here's kind of a quiz for you. 2 spars and a connecting ferrule. Now, you should immediately see the problem here. And when would that problem arise? The problem is that when we stick the bottom stick into the ferrule, it's going to go into the ferrule, making it actually shorter, so that we have one side that's longer and one side that's shorter. Now, one way to look at it is that now your ferrule is slightly offside, even by, 1.5 inches or 2 inches, even a little bit. Then having it offsides means that, most of the time it might fly well, but in heavy wind, that's when you're going to see the problem. So that's the answer to question 2. Now, if you're doing a box kite, the kite needs to have aligned surfaces. So that's the sail that needs to be aligned. And one of the ways you can do that is hold the kite up and look to see whether you're seeing straight through the kite. Another is that if you have surfaces that are misaligned to the wind, that could cause problems. If you're going to repair the fabric with applique. I feel that that's best. Tape is, I think, also and almost as good depending on the tape that you use. And if you're going to repair paper, I really prefer cellophane tape, because cellophane tape is quick and easy, and you really don't have to worry about the weight. The cellophane tape tends to be so light that even on a small fighter, it won't sort of weigh one side down over the other. Okay, so now I have 11 case studies that I wanted to go through. And I'm going to start by saying that kites don't just fly. What we do is we make them fly. And some people have some interesting designs right off the table. They know they're not going to fly, and then they start making adjustments. So here's an example of a kite that I saw flying in Maine. And I hope you can see the video because the kite is circling. And after that, what I would do is take the kite down and make some changes to it. What many beginners do is they just continue trying, hoping that the kite's going to fly better. And if you notice, that kite had a tail. So here in the first case study, the kite was spinning and crashing. So the kite really needed a proper angle of attack, and it needed additional drag. And that's a common problem. So that kite that we just saw in the video, spinning, could probably be solved by changing the bridle and adding additional tails or longer tails. And my preference over additional tails is long tails. Next, I was at a festival, and the workshop that they were doing at the festival had a folded paper kite. You might have seen it. You can take an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, fold it into a kite, add a tail, add a stick on the back, punch a hole for the bridle point, and it flies. But these wouldn't fly. I didn't see any of the kids' kites that had made this workshop kite flying at all. The problem with that was the spreader that they're using was too stiff, and they had no dihedral or bow at all. They just had a flat back where the spreader on the back was just too stiff. So the solution was either bend the stick on the back or use a more flexible spreader. I recommended coffee stirrers because they have just a little bit of bend to the plastic and they would spill the wind better. Here's a case study, and the plan on the right kind of gives you an idea what I'm talking about. The festival provided these printed sheets, so they were handing out sheets to the public to build a sled, and the tails were actually strips off of the paper. Well, none of them, and I mean absolutely zero, were flying. And the problem was that the printer had tried to compress the plan and put the instructions on the side of the plan. And that meant that they had changed the shape of the sled, and that meant that none of the sleds flew after that. So what we did was we corrected the proportions of the sled, and they had to reprint all of the sheets. So here's another case study. As the wind increased, the kites weren't flying steadily. Now, in this case, short tails were provided. You know, in this case, you could see that the tail is just a little bit longer than the height of the kite. And what we did was we added a second tail to each of the kites in order to handle the stronger wind conditions. I like this one. An eddy kite wouldn't fly. And the problem was, and in this case, a lot of people, we had mentioned this earlier, many people make the mistake of attaching the flying line to the back of the kite, even on brand new kites. And it's kind of hard to indicate that to somebody because some people just assume that the kite should be more like a scoop than like a boat plowing into water. So one of the things that I've done many times is tell people to remove the rubber band around the package tails. And they're always like, oh yeah, I should have done that. One woman I remember bought a kite, opened it, dropped the spars on the ground, and then the kite wouldn't fly. She actually went back, got another one, dropped the second set of spars on the ground, saying that they were missing. And then we found the spars at her feet and attached them and had it fly. Now, this was an airfoil kite. It was brand new. It came with a drogue, but the kite was swaying left and right in flight. That's called yaw. And the problem was that the aspect ratio was too high. So it's a little bit too wide in order for it to fly well. And what we did was we took the the line that goes to the drogue and lengthened that line. And that made the kite a little bit taller, and we got perfectly steady flight from that airfoil kite afterward, that fluted foil. I was watching a teacher build a miniature kite with kids, but the miniature kite was unable to fly. And for that one, the sail loading wasn't right. For the size of the kite, the paper that they were using typing paper, some people call it copy paper, was too heavy. So by using lightweight tissue paper or something lighter, instead of copy paper, that same miniature kite could have flown. Here's a case study about a fox kite. And I was at a kite festival in which somebody had one of these fox kites, and the wind was strong enough, and what the wind did was it was pushing both sides of the kite back, and it was turning it into this kind of narrow V-shaped thing. And I mean pushing it back strongly. Maybe spars were missing, but the kite was not getting any lift, so it wasn't able to really get high in the sky or even high enough to really fly. So what we did was we added a thin spreader across the top, and that gave it more stiffness, keeping the kite more open, and then the kite was flown to the end of the line. And the people who had just bought that fox kite were very happy. Now, here's a guy on the right-hand side with his head a little bit tilted to the left. We had a kid in our neighborhood who always had their head tilted to the left, and the nickname for that person was 10 to 6. I always liked that. But here's a case study about a rokako that didn't fly well. It leaned to one side and crashed. And just the leaning is an indication that something's wrong. This kite, when it crashed, it was stuck in a tree. Pulling that kite forcefully out of the tree, it then had 3 broken spars and was torn in 4 places. What I did was I took the sail, repaired it, and then folded it along the spine so that I could see whether the sides were equally matched. And they weren't. So what I did was I adjusted the spine and made sure that the sides were equal. I don't think in that case I had to remove fabric. On other kites that I've built, I've done this technique of folding in half to make sure I have symmetry. But that kite that had 3 broken spars and was torn in 4 places flew better than ever. Now, this was interesting. I was in Canada at a festival, and this guy, the builder, he came to me and he said, I built 2 identical sled kites. One of them flies and the other one doesn't. And he said, for the life of me, I can't understand why 2 identical kites would fly differently. Well, first of all, they must not be identical in some way. And what they had was the one that flew had this green line attachment. It was straight off of the sled. The one that didn't fly had the bridle attachment going up. So what he had was only about an inch difference of the bridle attachment, and that was what was causing the sled not to fly. Here's a case study about a sled kite that didn't fly very well, and it was turning and crashing. I don't know why I have a sled and a diamond kite in the same case study, but in this case, I remember that it was a diamond kite, and this was something that I've rarely seen, but the kite wasn't flying because the spar into the wingtips had the wingtips twisted, and that twist in the wingtips, the pockets, gave it sort of a propeller effect and was causing the kite to turn and crash. So that's it for my case studies. Now I wanted to talk about some of the actions that people take in the field, because you could bring the kite back to the workshop, and what we do on the field is usually assume that the kite is symmetric and balanced. Taking it out of the bag, if you buy a kite, or building it, you often assume that you've built it in a symmetric and balanced way. One of the things that I've noticed that I've done when I build a kite is I will put a ruler across from the spine to one side and then from the spine to the other side, making sure that I have an equal number of inches or centimeters left and right. Well, if you're not careful, your ruler could be slightly angled up or down. Even if it's just angled up and down on one side, you could get a different measurement and end up having a slightly different sail on the left or the right side. So you might need to check the symmetry and balance of a kite that you've built or bought. What we typically do in the field is we switch to a kite that's tuned for the current wind speed. That means that we can put away the one that's not working and worry about it later and fly a kite that's flying very well. Just as a note, larger kites tend to have a larger wind range than smaller kites. So some actions in the field, some easy adjustments are increase the bow or the curve of the kite. If you have a tension line, that makes it easy. Adjust the angle of attack into the wind. Typically, if you change the angle of attack, that means that this kite is going to fly higher. If you change the angle of attack like this, and I'm meaning changing the angle of attack on the bridle, that means the kite's going to fly lower. An alternative is to add tails or drogues on the field. One thing that is very successful is flying a kite at a higher altitude, because the wind at the higher altitude might be stronger, steadier, and more consistent than the winds at a lower altitude, especially if you have the ground effect, and especially if you have, I don't know, things blocking the wind. So a higher altitude can often do the trick. One of the things I like about flying at a higher altitude is if the kite is coming down, you have more time to run and pull on the line to get to recover. And another thing is, if you have a kite at a higher altitude, the kite takes longer for it to reach the ground on its own. So during that time, the wind itself might pick up again, bringing the kite back into steady flight. So a higher altitude of flight can be very helpful. Now I have for you a kite repair checklist. And what you could do is ask yourself, gee, what is the kite? What specifically? It hurts when I do this. What specifically is the kite doing wrong? Often the answer is, I told you, it doesn't fly. So we have to think about, in flight, what is it doing? If the kite is doing the red thing, which is roll, so airplanes and kites behave the same way. It's roll, which is this way, pitch, which is like the kite rising or falling, or an airplane taking off, for example. And the third one, yaw, is the swimming that you see in flight. That's roll, pitch, and yaw. So to correct roll, you often have an asymmetric left and right size. That's when you especially want to look at the spreaders and the size of the sail. For pitch, which is this kind of red or pink illustration here, rarely do you get pitch problems, but in that case, you might want to strengthen the spine, lower the toe point. I was able to get a kite to exhibit a pitch problem. Actually, I intentionally wanted it to do it because I wanted the kite to swim a little bit like this. So what I did was, instead of having the tails in line with the kite, I think what I did was, I think I created like a rudder on the kite, like a roller would have a rudder, and then I think I attached the tails to that, so the tails were actually pulling the sail down, and then it would kind of recover before the tails would pull it down again. So rarely do you see pitch, but yaw you see all the time. Add more tails, adjust the bridle. One alternative is, if you have a 2-point bridle, you could go to a 3-point bridle to steady out the left and right side, but that's kind of like a patch rather than fixing the problem to correct yaw. But if you need to do it, that's also an alternative. Now, when hunting for problem areas, grab the bridles and pull them tight. You're going to hold the bridles together at the kite side and then see whether there's any slack in one of the lines. I've said it a few times, fold the sail in half, it should be exact. Stretch your bridle lines, not just equalizing them, but if you have a multi-line flying lines, you might want to equalize those. Flex the spars, I've mentioned that before, using both hands to flex them, even by putting the ferrules in as if they were in the kite to see whether everything is symmetric. And if you're using carbon fiber tubes, roll the spar in your hands and listen for cracks, because that can be a dead giveaway that a tube is cracked in some place, and that crack might not be visible. And it might become visible later, especially if you fly it and it cracks more. So the high wind speeds tend to exaggerate problems, so that a kite that might fly steadily one day might tilt to the side when the wind picks up, and then recover when the wind is better. So high winds tend to exaggerate the problems. I was on a kite flying field, and one guy had a very cleanly built kite that was brand new, but one of the problems was that the knots that he had in the bridle lines were kind of slipping, and once they slipped, the kite was actually flying sideways, completely but continued to fly. But that was not his intention for that kite. So here's a kite repair checklist. Check the directions. That's really for our beginners that take a kite out of the bag and ignore the directions and make mistakes. Make sure that all spars are inserted properly. Make sure that the spars go all the way into the pocket, that they're equal on the left and the side. Make sure that the spine is in the center. Make sure that you replace cracked or broken spars with identical spars. Make sure that the assembled kite is symmetrical, and it has to be symmetrical in 3 ways. The size of the kite, left and right, should be symmetrical. The weight of each side should be symmetrical, and the flexibility of the left and right side should also be symmetrical. Make sure the bridle's not slipping, tangled, knotted, or make sure that the bridle's not on the wrong side of the kite. I had a kite that flew pretty well upside down, but that also wasn't my intention, and I didn't think it would go on very long that way. Now, the bridle sets the correct angle of attack of the kite, so that might be something that you need to adjust. Make sure the sail's not torn. That's pretty obvious. Make sure that the pockets themselves are intact and they're not twisted. I had a pocket, and what happened to the pocket was that the pocket was folded and then creased very heavily. So the crease in the pocket weakened the fibers, and the stick pushed through that, and that was actually repeated on other kites that were built that way. Make sure that the tails are fully extended. I've talked to probably more than a dozen people, maybe many dozen, who just forget to take the rubber band off the tails and extend the tails. I recommend attaching tails to center. You don't have to do that, but don't attach tails where they change the angle of flight, like I was mentioning for that kite that I wanted to do a pitch demonstration. Delta kites, you've probably done this as many times as I have, is tell people to slide the spars all the way down to the wingtips to get the Delta kite to fly best. Now, after the repair, test your finished kite and fly it in an open area and take photos and share them online. I think you're really going to get some satisfaction. I like that idea of a kite repair table. I remember helping someone with a bridle on their kite, and the smile on their face after the kite flew was absolutely precious. It was something that I think I'm going to remember for the rest of my life, because they had spent so much time building a kite And by changing the bridle, we got it to fly perfectly. It's almost as good as building the kite yourself. So thanks very much. Here's my kite books on Amazon.com. A lot of the topics that I've talked about in here have come from the Kite Repair Handbook. All of these are on Amazon right now. Some of the topics are also expressed in Kite Physics, but more directly in the Kite Repair Handbook. I think my most recent is the Kite Repair Handbook, and before that, the one on kite design. So that's it for my presentation. Thanks very much. I wish to open it up if we want to have some discussion.
Hey, Glenn, real quick. I'm just going to put this out there. I have to jump and get the next session started, but everyone feel free to continue having a chat in here. The recording and the meeting will stay open until the last person leaves. Next up, we do have Kevin Coleman presenting how to make large-scale templates for applique. He's a fairly new kite flyer and super excited to be sharing this. So I'm going to hand it back over to Glenn to moderate, and I will probably be jumping out in just a second.
I was sure that Ron was going to say something right away.
Thanks, Glenn.
I was going to mention that a rule of thumb on bridles
Yeah.
is that if the kite is squirrely, but everything seems like it's where it should be, moving it back, as you said, gives it stability, but less lift. But in the times where it's just lagging back there and doesn't seem to be getting the proper lift, moving it forward gives you more lift, but makes it more squirrely. And there may come a time when you're trying to find the compromise that there is no compromise. The point where it's not squirrely is also the point where it starts falling out of the sky. So it's very powerful.
What I would add to that, Dave, is that I would tend to find the best compromise, move it a little bit higher and add tails, because then you have the added lift and you have the added drag, and sometimes that works well.
Yes, I think balancing between angle of attack and tails or drogues, I mean, that gives you two balancing features. But I have to say that certainly in some of the kites that I have built, they won't fly. You know, and when you're designing your own kites, you just have to accept the fact that there's no sweet spot in every kite. Certainly the kites that keep
For every wind,
the way you would adjust it.
Right, and Dave's point about the wind is also very good, that you might build a kite and expect, gee, I'd like to test it right now, but you don't have the wind to test it right now, the right wind for that kite. And I've built heavy wind kites and I've built light wind kites, and you don't want to test the right kite in the wrong wind.
I've busted a kite that way.
Anybody else? Daryl, Mark? Chris said, any tips for a foil kite that swings side to side? And an example I gave with a picture was taking the foil kite and lengthening the line that connects it to the drogue, for example. That will stop it from the side-to-side motion. Foils can be difficult to adjust because you have to make sure that the sail is all done properly, and that might take a bit of investigation, but lengthening the line to the drogue could be a quick solution.
Glenn, could I add something to that?
Sure.
If your drogue is flying off a central line off the back of a soft kite, it doesn't work so well as if you have it flying off of a V-shaped lines leading to a drogue behind it. If you have a line in each of the back corners, the longer you make that line, essentially the longer you're making the whole kite. That entire kite is now lengthened.
Yeah, I said that. Yeah.
And so, that doesn't work if you have a single line to the drogue, but it does work if you have a double line.
Yeah, and one way to do that is have a long double line coming to a point and then extending with a single line down to the drogue, so that you could extend that line as long as you want, and if necessary, adjust the length of that pretty easily.
Oh, I was going to add.
What you don't want is, you don't want to have too short a V, because that would pull the sides of the kite together.
I was going to add one other thing on large soft kites that are showing a little bit of yaw, but specifically when you've got variable winds. And sometimes you have to fly in variable winds when you're at a kite festival and you're invited. So you put it up in the air and it wants to do some yaw, but by taking and pulling down on the line when it starts to yaw just a little bit and then bringing it back up, it centers itself again. It means you have to actively be watching that kite, but it's a kite you're not going to be able to stick out on the ground anyway and ignore because of that the wind. And it really does work.
I've got an angle of attack question or observation.
Sure.
And it's to do with your point about the long line. So you pointed out the long line allows the kite more time before, if it's losing altitude, it's got more altitude to lose before it hits the ground. But does angle of attack actually change with altitude, or does angle of attack, or maybe it depends on how it's bridled, not change with altitude as the line pulls on it? Because then if you have a long line, then it would also be changing angle of attack more slowly with the loss of altitude, which could be another benefit. But I don't know. I'm trying to imagine if a kite, does it change angle of attack like it's pivoting?
Yeah, Jason, this is a really good question about the physics of how kites fly.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you'll see, and you'll probably see very often, is that a kite doesn't just stay at a certain altitude. The kite will rise to a higher altitude and then return to an altitude, and the kite will drop to a certain altitude and then return to an altitude. So that altitude, let's call that middle one stable. And what happens is the kite has less wind, so it drops, and then the wind picks up and it rises. So the angle of attack is pretty much the same, but the kite is facing the wind more when it's lower. That gives it more of a chance to rise. And when the kite is higher, let's say it's at this altitude, there's less surface area hitting the kite, so there's less wind to give it lift, and it comes back to stability. So the angle that the kite is facing the wind changes because it's still attached, but the wind is bringing the kite up and down, and then finally returning to stability.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect explanation, Jason. The thing is that the length of line, let's say you're flying on a fixed length of line, that length of line represents the radius of a circle.
Yeah.
If there's more of a vertical vector pushing the kite higher because there's higher wind, you're actually going to change the angle because the radius of that circle has changed, and you just further along the circumference of the circle. And so, if you've got a stable angle, it'll drop a little bit, it'll raise a little bit, but it should self-correct to that perfect place for that level
stability,
of wind.
Right. Good stuff. Any other comments or questions?
Glenn, have you used the acid-free tapes for paper kites that you didn't want to hurt as much as?
I haven't. Not really important to me. Usually the paper kites that I build are for kids, so I want cheap and quick.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Another answer to that is if I'm building something that I want to be, say I'm building something for myself, instead of tape, I might use glue, because then I can be very precise about how little I put on the kite. And depending on what I'm doing is, for example, if I'm doing paper to wood, then I'll use a paint that's lighter than tape. So acid-free, I don't really think about.
Okay, there are some acid-free glues, bookbinder glues, that I use on my miniatures because I don't want them yellowing.
Right.
And they do last.
Yeah.
Although I have to say, Glenn, my experience has been similar to yours. If I have an old paper kite, like an old Japanese kite, I have some older kites, I repair them with archival PVA glue and paper. So I'm basically making my own tape with a similar color and type of paper, washi paper, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And I use PVA glue the same as bookbinders do, and essentially making tape that won't deteriorate the kite.
Right. And if it's archival, that's important. If that's not important, then what you're doing is extra work, because the cellophane tape is just as light a repair as repairing it yourself using glue and tissue paper. I've done both.
I have fighter kites that are probably as much tape as they are paper. And they fly just fine.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much, everybody. We are going to go on to the next presentation. If you have any comments or suggestions, you could always send me email, or kitingusa.com is my website. So thanks very much, and I hope to see you at my presentation tomorrow, where I'll do some miniature kites. Thanks, Catherine.
Hi, Catherine. Just remember our meeting in Fano, and the calendar is still on my to-do list. Didn't forget, but didn't have opportunity yet to do it. Anyway, thanks for the plan.
Hey, Kat, how you doing?
I don't think she's there anymore.